Hey guys, it's Tori, and this week I want to discuss my learning to love classics story as well as giving you guys a few tips. So classics can be really hard to get into. I know a lot of people really want to get into classics, but they just don't know where to start. At least that's been my experience. Ever since I was little, honestly, I've always had a curiosity about classics. I'm not completely sure when it started for me, this curiosity with classics. I would have to say it was probably about the time I read Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. I think. Yeah, Cornelia Funk, and I probably mispronounced that. I'm sorry if I did, but anyway, I read that series and I just fell in love with Maggie's love of classic books. And that sort of feeling continued as I watched adaptations of Little Women, as I watched Gilmore Girls, seeing Rory, who loves reading books and classics in particular. And I just always had a curiosity about it, but I just didn't know where to start. To be quite honest, I didn't know what books to read. I didn't feel like I had a lot of support. That makes it sound like so depressing and stuff, but like I just didn't have people around me who were reading classics, who were encouraging me to try out classics as much. I did have one friend who gave me a few to read that she had read in school, but I didn't really love it, the ones that she was reading at least. So I just kind of had this desire in the back of my head throughout my life, throughout my schooling, and I just never really read very many classics until my sophomore year of high school. I was told by my friend about this class she was taking, AP Literature, with a particular teacher that she just loved. She loved the class, and she told me that I should give it a shot. So I was like, what the heck, why not? Let's do this. So that next year I took AP Literature, and the first book we read over the summer was Wuthering Heights. And when I read it, I actually didn't really love it, but when we discussed it in class, I started understanding more the symbolism behind classics, gained a better appreciation for character development in that class, and I started getting more comfortable with the language. However, a problem that kind of kept dogging me throughout that time, throughout the rest of my high school experience, as I kept trying to read more classics and I was reading more than I ever had before, was that my ability to comprehend books has always been, I don't want to say a struggle, because I was like a straight A student. I was in the highest reading levels within my class, always, throughout elementary school and everything. But when they do the little reading tests in elementary school, I don't know if you remember those, but my reading speed was fine and my pronunciation was fine and all that, but my comprehension sometimes struggled a little bit. I don't want to make it sound like I had a learning disability, because I feel like it's unfair for someone to say that they had a learning disability or make it seem that way when they didn't, when there are people who actually do have learning disabilities and have to overcome that. So I don't want to make it sound like that, but I did just struggle with it a little bit more compared to the other aspects of reading that I was doing better at. And so I didn't really ever notice a problem, however. Like, my mom would tell me, like, oh, your points on comprehension were just a little bit on the lower side compared to the rest of your scores, and I was like, well, I felt like I got it. I don't know what the problem is. But when I read classics, I definitely began to notice the issue. There was actually like one or two books that we read in my my AP Literature class that things happened and they'd like talk about it in class, and I'd be like, I totally missed that. I did not think that happened. Even like big things like Tess of the D'Urbervilles was one we read, and there's a lot of big events in that book, but one of the big events, for some reason, I did not get it. Like, I totally missed it, but everybody else in the class seemed to know what actually happened. I totally misunderstood it. So I started recognizing how that made it a little harder for me to get into classics, because I just didn't always comprehend them as well. So I decided to just keep reading. I continued to read up until my mission. Right after I graduated high school, I went for 1.5 years to Michigan, and during that time, just because of the rules, I wasn't allowed to read anything outside of religious texts. We were too busy anyway to read anyway, so it was fine, but I didn't get to read very much. But during that time I did obviously think about books and what I was excited to read when I got home, and some books that kept coming into my mind were classics, and one of them was Little Women, actually, which quickly became one of my favorites, as well as The Phantom of the Opera, which is another new favorite of mine since coming home and reading it. And so after my mission, just started reading more and more and more classics. At this point, it's almost all I want to read. At least so for the past like couple months, I just have really just wanted to read classics, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful feeling. If it wasn't clear from that story, it took me years to get into classics, and I'm not saying anybody watching this, it's gonna take you years. It probably won't. You have to keep in mind, I was a child, I was a teenager, I had a lot of things I was trying to figure out in my life, so it just took me a lot longer. There are many of you watching who I'm sure want to read classics but aren't quite sure where to start and are a little intimidated by them, which is totally fair. I still get intimidated by some of them as well. But I wanted to give you a few tips based on my experience as to how you can learn to love classics. First of all, you just have to keep in mind that the language just takes time, and the older the book, the harder the language. I think the best place to start with the language, to start getting used to it, honestly, is probably the Victorian period. So like 1837 to 1901 is the Victorian time period. Really, even in the later part of that might be even better than the earlier part, just because as time goes on, language changes, and so the Victorian period is where it starts to be more like we talk today, although it is still a little different. Just keep in mind that it will take time. You'll have to read more than one book to get used to the language, and for some people it comes faster than others, and that's okay. The more you read, the easier the language will be to understand, and it'll all work out. It'll be fine. The second tip I want to give is that classics is not a genre. Classics are just books that were written a long time ago. So there are a variety of different types of books, different types of writing styles. It's just like modern books, just written longer ago. So don't go into it being like, oh, I read, what's a common classics people read and don't like? I don't know. I read The Great Gatsby and I didn't really like it, which I know a lot of people love that. Personally, I did not, but that is a different story. But if you just read one and you're like, I don't really like that, or you just have read them in school also, often if it's associated with homework, obviously you're not gonna love it as much. So just keep that in mind when you're trying out classics, and be willing to, again, give it time, keep trying. Piggybacking off of that, just also keep in mind that sometimes there are genres that maybe you don't really love the modern versions of those genres, but you might like them as a classic a little bit better. Personally, two genres that I don't really particularly love are romance and horror. I don't read those hardly at all. It's just not my thing. However, when it comes to classics, I am a lot more willing to read a classic romance, mostly because there's a lot more involved in it. Obviously, back in the day, so to speak, marriage was more of a business transaction and family was a lot more involved. You know, nowadays it's common to be like, well, it doesn't really matter what my family thinks, I'm still gonna marry him, or it's more about just the love itself. Nothing else really matters as much. And back in the day, that's not the case. So when you read a classic romance, there's a lot more family involvement, and there's a lot more cultural and societal needs and ideals of the time play a role in it as well. And so it's a lot more interesting to me. As for horror, I really am just a scaredy cat and I do not like horror novels. However, classic horror is fascinating to me. It just has the right amount of spookiness without going over the top. And I found some classic horror novels that I've actually really enjoyed and had a lot of fun with. So don't be afraid to break out of your comfort zone a little bit when it comes to picking genres within classics, because you might be surprised. You might end up liking something that you would never like in a modern written novel, but in a classic written novel, it's just the right kind of style or has the right tropes to get you to enjoy that genre. So be bold with classics. Just go for ones that you think sound even slightly interesting and you may be surprised. And last, don't be afraid to listen to audiobooks. Sometimes it makes it a lot easier to understand. Personally, I've realized the reason why I struggled with comprehension while reading was because I'm definitely more of an audible learner. I learn a lot better when I'm able to hear something than when I'm looking at something, if that makes sense. And I've been able to work through that. Audiobooks really help me when, especially with more dense classics or more long classics, it helps me to get through them a lot faster and a lot more effectively. Great app. If you want to try the audiobook route, definitely try out LibriVox. This is a free app that contains all books that are in the public domain and puts them in audiobook format, and they are completely free. There are commercials, so be forewarned about that. Obviously they have to pay for their service somehow, but it's amazing. You do sometimes have to search a little bit. They'll have multiple audiobooks for the same book sometimes, and you'll want to try to find narrators that you can listen to, as they're not professionals and they're all volunteers that do it. I was so grateful when I discovered LibriVox because it has made quite the difference for me in coming to love classics more and more, as well as just even for like school assignments. So that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down below some tips you have for learning to love classics. At some point I think I will do a classics to start with, so I can talk about specific books that are good places to start. Let me know if you are curious and would like to hear about that, so I can decide how soon to make that video, if that makes sense. And yeah, that's everything. I hope you are having a wonderful day. Be sure to like this video and subscribe if you want to see more of my videos, and I will talk to you next week. Bye!